My name is Aileen, and I'm 43 years old. 12 years ago, my parents looked at my 5-year-old autistic son and called him a burden that would destroy our family. They gave me one choice: lock him away in an institution or lose everything. I chose my son. They took the house, cut every form of support, and spent the next 12 years telling our entire town I was the selfish daughter who abandoned them and hid their only grandson out of pure spite. Last winter, one of his paintings sold for $2.3 million. 3 months later, they arrived with a lawyer, demanding their share and calling me unfit to manage my own child's money. I didn't argue. I told my attorney 3 words: let them talk. What happened next in that room destroyed the story they had spent 12 years building. If you're watching this, please subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. The letter came on a gray Tuesday in February, and I knew what it was before I opened it. The envelope was heavy, the kind of paper you pay extra for, with a law firm's name pressed into the corner in raised gray letters. Prescott, Scott and Associates. I set it on the kitchen counter next to a mug of tea I'd already let go cold, and I stood there for a while, just looking at it. 12 years of silence, and now this. Whatever else my parents had become, they had learned to spend money on the right stationery. Inside, the language was polite in the way a closing door is polite. My clients, it said, seek recognition of their standing as grandparents and reimbursement for prior family support. There was a second paragraph, softer on the surface and much worse underneath. Given the mother's history, it read, a neutral fiduciary may better serve the minor's interests. I read that sentence twice. Then I found a pencil and underlined the words, the mother's history, because that was the part that told me everything. They weren't guessing about my history. They had spent more than a decade writing it. I want to be clear about what they were actually asking for, because the letter dressed it up in soft clothes. My son, Elliot, is 17. Last winter, a painting he made sold for $2.3 million, and because he is a minor, that money doesn't sit in a checking account where anyone can reach it. It sits in a custodial trust with his name on it, and I am the custodian. My only job is to guard it until he's old enough to guard it himself. My parents wanted 2 things from that trust. They wanted a piece of the money, and they wanted the right to decide what happened to the rest. To get the second thing, they needed a judge to believe I couldn't be trusted with it. And to make a judge believe that, they had a story ready. They'd had it ready for years. They didn't want a grandson. They wanted a percentage. But the money was never the part that frightened me. It was the story. I took the letter to a lawyer named Meredith Vance, who works out of a small office downtown with 1 desk lamp and too many legal pads. She read it slowly, and when she finished, she took off her glasses and told me something I didn't expect. She said we could fight it the loud way, or we could let them talk. Let them put every claim in their own words, out loud, on the record, in front of a witness. Words are easier to answer than feelings, she said. Let them commit to it. I told her I'd think about it. On my way out, she added one more thing, almost as an afterthought. She said that in cases like this, the person who stays calm is usually the person telling the truth, and that juries and judges can feel that even when they can't explain it. I carried that sentence home with me. It felt less like legal advice and more like permission to stop performing. That night, I found Elliot in the corner of the apartment he uses as a studio, standing in front of a canvas with a brush he wasn't moving. He communicates in his own way. Short sentences, mostly. Sometimes a note. Sometimes he types. Sometimes he answers a question 3 hours after you asked it, when you've already forgotten you asked. I told him there would be a meeting, that his grandparents wanted to talk about the money, and that he did not have to be anywhere near it. He set the brush down and looked at a spot just past my shoulder, the way he does when he's choosing his words carefully. I want to be there, he said. On the table beside him was a small tin box I hadn't seen out in years. I didn't think much of it in that moment. I should have. He said it the way he says things he has already decided, with no argument left in it. And to understand what he had decided, you have to go all the way back. Back 12 years, to a diagnosis, and a kitchen, and a choice that split my life cleanly into a before and an after. Elliot was 4 when the word came home with us from a specialist's office, folded into a pamphlet I kept in my coat pocket for a week because I couldn't figure out where else to put it. Autism. The doctor was kind about it. She talked about strengths and supports and early intervention, and I nodded and took the handouts. And then I drove home feeling the ground rearrange itself under the car. He was still my boy. He still lined his crayons up by shade before he'd use a single one. He still laughed at the sound of hard rain on the window. He still reached up for my hand in parking lots without looking. Nothing about him had changed in that office, only the map of the road ahead had. My parents' reaction taught me the shape of the next 12 years, though I didn't understand it yet. My mother, Vivian, did not ask how he was doing, or how I was holding up. She asked what people would think. "People will say there's something wrong with us," she said, in the same voice she used for spills on the carpet and gossip at church, the two being roughly equal threats in her mind. My father, Douglas, said nothing at all, and I would spend the next decade learning that his nothing was its own kind of answer. For a while I told myself they just needed time to catch up to a word that had frightened them. Then, in January, they decided time wasn't necessary. We were at their kitchen table, the one I'd eaten breakfast at every morning of my childhood, and my mother laid it out for me like a household budget she'd already balanced. There were places for children like Elliot, she said. Facilities. Good ones, she was quick to add, as if the quality were the issue. He could be somewhere he'd be properly looked after, and I could be free. Free to start over, to meet someone, to have the normal life I was throwing away. My father finally spoke, and what he said I have never been able to unhear. "You can be part of this family," he told me, "or you can keep him. Not both. Here is the part that matters, the part that explains why I stayed quiet for so long afterward. The house we lived in belonged to them. The small monthly help that kept us above water while I worked and juggled therapy schedules belonged to them. They weren't offering me a choice between two feelings. They were offering me a choice between my son and a roof, my son and a family, my son and every safety net a young mother has. They knew exactly how much weight that put on the word no. They were counting on it. I said it anyway. I said, "I'm keeping him." My mother folded her hands on the table and looked at me the way you look at a stranger who's wandered into the wrong pew, polite and already gone, and that was the last real conversation I would have with either of them for 12 years. What I didn't know, driving away that night with Elliot asleep in the back seat and a diaper bag full of broken crayons on the floor, was that they had already made a phone call I wasn't part of. A few weeks later, an envelope arrived from a place called Millbrook Residential Center. I had never contacted them. I'd never heard the name. I opened it standing at the counter of the apartment I was still learning to call home, and I understood, slowly, what I was holding. It was intake paperwork. My parents had reached out to Millbrook about placing a child, and because that child was a minor, and because I was his only legal parent, the center was required by law to contact me for consent before anything could happen. Folded inside, so I could review what had been submitted, was a copy of the letter my mother had written to them. "Our family is no longer able to care for the child," it said, in her small, careful, unmistakable handwriting. "We request placement." I did not sign the consent. I wrote back that I was his mother, that he was staying with me, and that there would be no placement. Now or ever. And then I did something I've turned over in my head 1,000 times since. I did not throw the letter away. I put it in a tin box on the top shelf of the hall closet, and I told myself I would never need it. It felt like keeping proof that a fire had happened, long after the house was already ash. Then I drove us the 2 hours south to Cincinnati, to a one-bedroom apartment I could barely afford, and I started our whole lives over with almost nothing. By the time I'd flattened the last moving box, I was already the villain of a story I hadn't even heard yet. That first apartment had a radiator that clanked all night and a bedroom window that faced a brick wall 6 feet away, and for a long time it was the entire world. I worked mornings at a medical billing office and 3 evenings a week at a pharmacy counter, and in the hours between, I learned my son. That's the only honest way to say it. Not fixing him, not curing him, learning him, the way you learn a language you weren't born into. I learned that a certain kind of fluorescent hum made his whole body go rigid, so I mapped which stores had which lights. I learned that transitions went smoother if I gave him a 5-minute warning and then a 2-minute one, and that skipping the warnings cost us an hour. I learned that he understood far more than he could say and remembered nearly everything, and that if I lied to him to make my own life easier, he always knew. Money was tight in a way that has its own particular texture, a way where you know the exact price of everything and buy almost none of it. I got good at the arithmetic of a grocery cart. But that was not the hard part. The hard part had a phone number. There were nights, especially in the first couple of years, when I was so tired and so alone that I'd take out my phone and start dialing my mother, the way your hand reaches for a light switch in a house you no longer live in. I'd get to the last digit and stop, because I'd remember there was no longer anyone on the other end for me. The first few times it happened, I sat on the bathroom floor and cried as quietly as I could, so I wouldn't wake him. After a while, I stopped reaching backward at all. I started putting that same energy into reaching toward him, and that, it turned out, was the better direction to send it. I remember one afternoon at a grocery store when he was 6. The lights were the bad kind, and the freezer section was loud, and he came apart in the middle of the aisle, the way a small body does when the world has gotten too big and too sharp all at once. A woman stopped her cart and told me, in the helpful voice people use for cruelty, that a firmer hand would fix that. I didn't argue with her. I got down on the floor next to my son, at his level, and I waited. And I counted with him under my breath. And when he was ready, we left the cart where it was and walked out into the parking lot and sat on the curb until the world was the right size again. I drove home shaking, but I understood something on that curb that I hadn't before. My job was not to make him easier for strangers. My job was to make the world survivable for him, one aisle at a time. School was its own kind of negotiation. I learned to sit in small rooms across from teachers and specialists, signing plans full of acronyms I'd had to teach myself, arguing politely for things that shouldn't have required an argument. A quiet corner, extra time, permission for him to draw when the words wouldn't come. Some teachers saw him. One in particular, a soft-spoken man who ran the resource room, told me once that Elliot noticed things the other kids walked right past, that he could tell when a picture on the wall had been moved half an inch. Others just saw a boy who wouldn't make eye contact and decided that was the whole of him. I got good at telling the difference quickly, and at being the kind of mother who is impossible to brush off without ever once raising her voice. Holidays were the hardest because holidays are built for the exact thing we no longer had. The first Thanksgiving on our own, I made a small dinner for 2, and we ate it at our little table, and Elliot arranged his food by color before he'd touch any of it. And I told myself this was enough. And by the end of the night, I almost believed it. So we built our own traditions out of what we had. Pancakes shaped like whatever he asked for. A walk in December to look at other people's lights. I stopped trying to recreate the family I'd lost and started building the one I actually had, which was 2 people and a radiator that clanked. And it was more than some people ever get. There were kindnesses along the way that I've never forgotten. A woman at the billing office named Dana who covered my shift without being asked the day Elliot ran a fever. A pharmacist who slid a coloring book across the counter for him on a bad afternoon and waved off the price. I mention them because it would be easy to tell this story as if the whole world had been cruel, and it wasn't. The cruelty had a return address, and it was in Ashford. Everyone else was just people, and most of them were kinder than the ones I was related to. Elliot didn't talk much in those years, but he was always saying something. He'd point to colors on a chart I'd taped by the door. He'd carry an object across the room and set it in my lap to tell me how his day had gone. And when he was 7, he wrote me his first full sentence, in pencil, on the back of a grocery receipt. It wasn't about school or dinner or anything I could have guessed. It was a question about them. Where are Grandma and Grandpa? No question mark. Just the words, and then his eyes on my face, waiting for an answer I didn't have. I didn't know how to explain estrangement to a 7-year-old, so I did what tired, hopeful parents do. I softened it. I told him families sometimes need time apart, and because he loved to make things, and because some small, stubborn part of me still believed that a grandmother could not stay angry at a child forever, I let him make birthday cards. Careful ones, with lopsided suns in the corners, and his name in shaky capital letters. Every year, on his birthday and on theirs, we sat at the kitchen table and made them together, and we walked to the blue mailbox on the corner, and he pulled the handle down and let them drop. They came back, every single one of them. The first time, I told myself the mail had made a mistake. The second time, I saw the stamp clearly, a red mark dragged across the front of my son's drawing. Refused. Return to sender. My mother had held a 5-year-old's crayon son in her hands and refused it, sent it back sealed and unopened, and done it again the next year, and the year after that. I kept letting him mail them longer than I should have, because I couldn't stand to be the one who took the hope away. I finally stopped around the time he turned 9. I never told him why. I told him the post office kept losing them, and I hated myself a little each time I said it. I put the returned cards in the tin box, next to the letter from Millbrook, and I closed the lid on both. I thought I was protecting him. What I did not understand, and would not understand for years, was that he had stopped believing the post office story long before I stopped telling it. The thing that finally gave Elliot a language wide enough to hold everything he carried was color, and it arrived in the form of a woman named Grace Whitfield. She ran art therapy groups out of a community center a few blocks from us, and I started bringing him when he was 10, mostly hoping it might help him settle after hard days at school. It did that. But Grace saw something else in the work, and she told me about it the way careful people tell you important things, slowly, without making a show of it. I remember the afternoon she pulled me aside. Elliot was at a low table working, completely somewhere else. "He isn't drawing what things look like," she said, watching him. "He's drawing what they weigh." I didn't fully understand her then. I do now. Where another child might paint a house, Elliot painted the specific loneliness of one lit window in a dark building. He noticed light the way other people notice sound, and he could put a feeling on a page that you didn't have words for until you saw it there. I sat in on a session once, at Grace's invitation. She'd given the group a simple prompt: paint a place where you feel safe, and while the other kids drew bedrooms and backyards, Elliot painted the inside of our car, the gray seats, the exact afternoon light through the windshield, the 2 travel mugs in the cup holders. When Grace asked him about it, he said the car was the place where nobody could ask him to be different. I had spent years feeling guilty about how much of his childhood happened in transit, driving between appointments, and here he was, telling me, in paint, that the car had been a refuge the whole time. That was the thing about his work. It kept handing me back my own life, seen from an angle I'd been too tired to notice on my own. And there was one subject he returned to again and again, long before any of the rest of this happened. A table, set for a meal with empty chairs around it. I asked him once who the chairs were for. He thought about it for a long moment, turning it over until he was sure of his answer. "This chair is for the people who didn't come," he said. I assumed he meant something general, an idea Grace had helped him name, a party where the guests were late. I was wrong about who the chairs were for. It would take me years to understand that he had known exactly who they were for the whole time. Because at some point, without telling me, Elliot had found the box. It was the year he turned 14. We were clearing out the hall closet to make room, and I stepped away to answer the door. And when I came back, the tin box was open in his lap. He didn't cry. He didn't ask me anything. He was reading the returned cards, one by one. And then he read the Millbrook letter. And then he closed the box and set it back on the shelf. Exactly where it had been. And he never said a single word about it. That silence should have told me something. Instead, I let myself believe he hadn't really understood what he was looking at. He understood all of it. The next series he began wasn't chairs anymore. It was envelopes. Stacks of them, painted with a precision that made your chest go tight. Each one marked with the same 2 red words. He worked on the largest one for the better part of a year, and he called it undeliverable. When I asked him what it was about, he answered without looking up. It's about things that never got where they were sent. I thought it was a metaphor, a gifted kid working through big feelings in the abstract. It did not occur to me, not for a long time, that he had painted those envelopes from memory, that he had held the originals in his own hands, at 14, on the floor of our hallway. Grace was the one who said the word gallery out loud first. She knew a woman named Marion Halstead who ran a small, serious space downtown, and she believed Elliot's work belonged in front of people. I was cautious to the point of being difficult. He was a minor, and a private one, and I was not going to hand my son to the world as a spectacle, an inspirational headline, a boy to be marveled at. So we set conditions before anything else. His face would not be used. His diagnosis would not be the sales pitch. The work would speak, and Elliot would keep his life to himself. Marion understood immediately, which is why I trusted her. I remember the first time she stood in front of Undeliverable in the back room of her gallery, and she didn't reach for anything clever to say. She just put her phone in her pocket and looked at it for a long time. "I've sold a lot of beautiful work," she said finally. "This is the first one that made me stop and just look." She turned to Elliot and asked him gently what the title meant. He said, "Ask the post office." I laughed, and Marion smiled, and neither of us understood how literal he was being. The work went into a group show first, hung modestly on a side wall. Then it earned a wall of its own. Word moved the way word moves in the art world, quietly, and then all at once. And collectors began asking about the young painter in Cincinnati who could make rejection look like weather. Marion managed all of it with a patience I'm still grateful for, never pushing him, never turning him into a story he hadn't agreed to be. The opening of that first group show is a night I keep folded up and take out sometimes. Elliot didn't want to be in the crowd, which we'd expected, so Marion set aside a quiet back room where he could sit with the work and come out only when he wanted to. I watched strangers stand in front of Undeliverable and go quiet in exactly the way Marion had the first time. One woman, an older collector in a gray coat, stood there so long that I went over to make sure she was all right. She had tears on her face. She told me the painting reminded her of a brother she'd stopped speaking to decades ago, of letters she'd meant to send and never had. She had no idea she was standing in front of the literal truth of one specific boy's childhood. She thought it was about her. That, I've come to understand, is exactly what made the work travel. Everyone who looked at those envelopes saw their own unopened mail, their own empty chairs, their own person who never wrote back. Elliot had painted the most private thing in the world and somehow turned it into a mirror. By the end of that year, serious people were saying his name in serious rooms. And last winter, at a gallery event I attended with my hands folded in my lap the entire evening, a collector named Gerald Ashby bought Undeliverable for $2.3 million. I want to be honest that a number like that is rare, and it didn't happen because the world is suddenly fair to autistic kids from small apartments. It happened because Ashby is the kind of collector whose attention alone can make a market, because the painting carried something people felt in their chests even when they couldn't name it, and because Marion had spent 2 quiet years making sure exactly the right eyes found it. The contract had one line I keep coming back to. Purchase price, $2,300,000. Elliot stood next to me in a button-up shirt he had chosen himself, looking at the floor, and I don't think either of us managed to breathe. Because he was 17, the money could not simply be handed over. It went into a trust in his name. A court appointed a woman named Ms. Farrow to review the sale on his behalf, to make sure a minor wasn't being taken advantage of, and she signed off only after checking that every part of it was clean and fair. Meredith, whom I had hired by then for exactly this kind of thing, gave me a single instruction and repeated it until it was carved into me. "The money is his," she said. "Your job is to guard it, not to touch it. Keep it that clean." So I did. I kept every statement and every record in a folder that never once had my name on a single withdrawal. The article that ran in the regional paper was kind. It called the painting a study of rejection and childhood and the ache of not being received. It had no idea how literal that was. It used Elliot's name because his name was part of his career now, but the photograph showed only the back of his head, the way we'd insisted. And 2 hours north, in a town called Ashford, someone was reading that same article and doing very different math with it. Within a week, my mother remembered my phone number. The voicemail came first, and I still have it. Her voice was warm in a way I had not heard in 12 years, syrup poured slowly over gravel. "We've missed him so much," she said. "Family should share good news." I noticed she used the word share before she ever used his name. That was the entire thing, right there, in the order of 2 small words. Then came the letter I've already described, the one from Prescott, and the machine behind it began to move. They wanted reimbursement for the years they had supported us, years that had ended the same night they threw us into the street. They wanted standing as grandparents, a legal foot wedged in the door. And underneath both of those, quiet and cold and patient, they wanted a judge to wonder whether I was stable enough, fit enough, to manage my own son's money. On paper, to a stranger, it almost sounded reasonable. Grandparents, blood, a vulnerable minor, and a very large sum of money. That was exactly what made it dangerous. I understood, sitting at my kitchen table with that letter, that if I walked into a meeting angry, if I raised my voice and defended myself and let myself cry, I would look like the very woman their letter described. To beat a lie that sounds reasonable, I could not sound like a wound. I had to let it stand on its own legs and watch it fail to hold any weight. Elliot heard more of this than I meant him to. He was in the next room when I played the voicemail a second time, trying to understand it, and he came and stood in the doorway, with a brush still in his hand. "They wouldn't open a card," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a fact he'd been carrying since he was 14. "Now they want the painting?" He said it the way you'd read a price off a tag, flat and certain, and then he went back to his easel, and I stood alone in the kitchen understanding that my son knew this story better than I did, and had for a long time. I found out how large their version had grown from my Aunt Nora. Nora is my father's sister, the kind of relative who still mails cards on holidays and means every word inside them. She texted me a few days after the sale, and I opened it expecting some version of congratulations. What I got was cool and disappointed, and it took me a full minute to understand it. "After all these years hiding him," she wrote, "the least you can do is let your parents be part of this now." Hiding him. I read the word 3 times before it landed. And that's when I understood the true size of what had been built while I was 2 hours away, working double shifts and learning my son. In Ashford, I was not the daughter who'd been thrown out for protecting a disabled child. I was the selfish one, the daughter who had cut her aging parents off out of spite and kept their only grandson from them for no reason anyone could name. They had not simply erased us, they had replaced us with a version of the story in which they were the ones left standing at a door I'd slammed. I called Nora, and what she told me made me sit down on the kitchen floor. For 12 years, my mother had performed a grief she had manufactured from nothing. At holidays, she would tear up about the grandson she wasn't allowed to see. At the Ashford Fellowship, the church where everyone knows everyone's business, she let the congregation comfort her about her cruel, distant daughter. My cousin Wade, who I'd chased through those same church halls as a kid, said it plainly when I reached him. "Your mom cried about it every Thanksgiving," he told me, a little defensive already. What were we supposed to think? Every Thanksgiving, she had set that grief on the table like a dish she brought each year, and every year the family had passed it around and believed it. Because why would a grieving grandmother lie about her own heartbreak? I sat down that night and typed 3 paragraphs to Nora and to the rest of them. The whole thing. The ultimatum, the house, the cutoff support, the returned cards, the letter from Millbrook. I had the receipts for all of it. I could prove every word I'd typed. Then I deleted it. I deleted it because I saw, suddenly, what I was doing. I was auditioning. Again. Standing in front of people who had already cast me in a role, begging them to recut the picture. I had spent 12 years not defending myself because defending myself felt like begging, and here I was, one viral painting later, about to beg louder than I ever had. And I thought, very clearly, that if words had never fixed this, maybe I had been carrying the wrong kind of proof all along. When I told Meredith I'd decided not to argue at the meeting, she nodded like I'd finally understood the assignment. "You don't win this by proving you're good," she said. "You win it by letting them prove what they are." She told me to let them make every claim out loud in front of Nora, on the record. For the first time in 12 years, I stopped trying to be believed. If you've ever been the villain in a story your own family told about you, and you know the exact feeling I'm describing, do me a small favor and comment one word. Scene. I read every one of them. There was still the question of the box. I took it down from the closet the week before the meeting and set it on the kitchen table and lifted the lid. The returned cards, stacked neatly by year. The Millbrook letter in my mother's handwriting. The proof had been on that shelf the entire time. I could end their story in about 90 seconds with what was inside it. But using it meant opening it in front of my son, letting him watch, at 17, in a room full of lawyers. Exactly what his grandparents had done to a 5-year-old who used to draw them sons. I didn't know if I had the right to do that to him, so I decided it wasn't mine to decide. It was his. I carried the box to his studio and started to explain, carefully, the way you'd approach a hard subject with anyone you love. I didn't get far. He looked at the tin, and then he looked at me, and he said, "I already know what's in it. I've known for years." And I understood, all at once and far too late, that he had carried this alone since he was 14. That the boy who painted envelopes had been painting the plain truth the whole time, in a language his grandparents had never bothered to learn. He put his hand flat on the lid, the way you'd put a hand on a shoulder. "Leave this to me," he said. He had known what he was going to do since the day he found that box. He'd just been waiting, without saying so, for them to come back. I handed him the box. And in the days before the meeting, he did something I only half noticed at the time. He sat with it and put the cards in order, oldest to newest, and he added one thing to it. A sealed envelope, made from thick paper he'd cut and folded himself, with his own handwriting on the front. I watched it go into the box. I did not open it. There are things you let a person hand you in their own time, when they're ready, and I could tell without being told that this was one of them. Their lawyer escalated before we ever sat down at a table together. In the last week, Prescott sent a follow-up that dropped the honey and showed the blade underneath. If a settlement could not be reached, they were prepared to file a petition questioning the minor's capacity to manage significant assets and requesting that his grandparents be appointed to oversee the estate. There it was. In plain language, they were going to argue that my son could not be trusted to make decisions about his own life, and they were going to use his autism to do it. That was the part that turned my hands cold. Not the money, and not even the smear. The image of my mother who had never once learned how Elliot thinks, who did not know that he understood every word said about him and filed it away, standing in front of a judge to declare him incapable. They had spent 12 years refusing to know him, and now they wanted to rule on his mind. Underestimating him was the single mistake I hoped, more than anything, that they would keep making right up until the last possible second. I spent a long evening with Meredith going over what a capacity fight would actually look like, and it frightened me in a way the money never had. She was honest with me, which I appreciated even when it hurt. A petition like the one they were threatening rarely succeeds against a fit parent with clean records, she said. Courts strongly favor keeping a child with the parent who has raised him, but rarely is not never, and a hearing would still mean strangers evaluating my son, asking him questions in rooms he hadn't chosen, deciding out loud whether his mind was sound. Even winning would cost him something. Even winning would mean letting my mother hold a microscope up to a boy she had refused to look at for 12 years. So we prepared for it the way you prepare for weather. Your praying won't come. Meredith gathered the trust records, the clean statements, Ms. Farrow's original sign-off, the therapy history that showed a boy who was thriving, not endangered. I gathered myself mostly. I practiced not flinching. And through all of it, Elliot stayed calm in a way that steadied me more than any legal file could. He wasn't preparing arguments. He was preparing a box. He seemed to understand, better than any of the adults around him, that the whole thing would come down not to what anyone said about him in that room, but to what he had quietly kept. The pressure that week came from every direction at once. Ashford went to work. My mother's version, now wearing a noble coat of paint, moved through the family like weather. It was for the boy's own good. That kind of money needed responsible adult hands. Cousins I hadn't heard from in a decade texted me about reconciliation, about how family is family and life is short. Even Nora, who had started to wonder, wavered on the phone. Just let them help manage it, she said. They're his family too, whatever else is true. Everyone kept saying that word, family, as if it settled the whole matter. As if it were a fact instead of a claim someone was making. And I thought quietly that I was about to let a small tin box define the word for all of them, once and for all. Elliot kept getting ready in his own way. The night before, I found him at the kitchen table with the box open, the cards squared into a perfect stack, the sealed envelope resting on top. I needed an order, he said, not looking up. Order helps. He wasn't nervous the way I was nervous. He was calm in the way you're calm when you've been rehearsing something in your head for 3 years and the day has finally arrived. I barely slept. He slept fine. What my son did the next morning changed everyone in that room, including the 2 people who walked in certain of everything. Stay with me. They drove the 2 hours down from Ashford and arrived at Meredith's office at 10, and the very first thing my mother did after 12 years of silence was compliment the light in the conference room. That was her opening line, a warm remark about the windows. She smiled at everyone as she came through the door. At Meredith. At Ms. Farrow, who had come to observe on Elliot's behalf. At me, briefly. She did not smile at Elliot. In fact, in the entire time they were in that room, I don't think she looked at him once. She had come to talk about him, to decide his future, and she could not bring herself to look at his face. We sat on one side of the long table, Elliot beside me, the tin box on his lap just under the table's edge, both of his hands resting flat on the lid. My mother, my father, and Prescott on the other side. And Nora at the far end, in a chair that belonged to no side yet. There because my parents had personally asked her to come as a family witness. They had chosen her because they were certain of her. It was their first mistake of the morning, though it would not be their last. Meredith opened by inviting them to state their position. And this is the one thing I had planned to do all day. Nothing. I folded my hands in my lap, and I let them talk. Every sentence they said was a sentence they would have to answer for very soon, and I wanted all of them on the record. Prescott went first, smooth and reasonable. His clients had supported their daughter and grandson for years. The estrangement that followed had caused them tremendous pain. They sought only what was fair, and given the circumstances, a serious question had to be raised about whether the current arrangement truly served the boys' interests. Then my mother took over, because she had been waiting 12 years for an audience this size and this attentive. She pulled a tissue from her sleeve before she needed one. She told them how she and my father had begged to be part of Elliot's life. How I had cut them off, moved him hours away, refused to let them anywhere near their only grandchild. How they had spent more than a decade grieving a boy they were never allowed to hold. "We tried so hard to see him," she said, and her voice broke right on schedule. "She wouldn't let us near her son." At the end of the table, Nora nodded along, the way she had nodded along for years, at holidays and in pews. She was about to hear the story end. Prescott brought it home gently, the way you'd lower something breakable onto a shelf. No one doubted the boy's talent, he said. They simply questioned his capacity to manage such a significant sum and proposed that his grandparents help oversee it for him. He said the boy. He gestured toward my son without once looking at him, the same way my mother hadn't looked at him, as if Elliot were a topic rather than a person sitting 8 feet away with his hands resting on a tin box. That was the sentence that made Elliot move. He lifted the box up onto the table. The sound it made, metal setting down on wood, was small, but it stopped the room. He opened the lid, and he began, without any hurry at all, to lay the cards out in a row across the table. Old birthday cards, the paper gone soft with age, lopsided suns in the corners, his name in a child's shaky capital letters. And across the front of each one, the same 2 words in dragged red ink. Refused. Return to sender. "These are the cards I sent you," he said. His voice was quiet and level. "Every year. You sent all of them back." My mother's face did something complicated. She said the post office must have made an error, that mail gets lost all the time, that this proved nothing at all. And Elliot, who had been waiting 3 years for exactly this moment, calmly laid down the next thing. He set the Millbrook letter on the table and turned it so it faced across the room, toward Nora. For a second no one spoke. Then Nora reached out and picked it up, and I watched her read it. And I watched the color of the entire afternoon change in her face. "Our family is no longer able to care for the child. We request placement." She looked at the handwriting the way you look at a familiar face somewhere it has no business being. "That's your handwriting, Vivian," she said. It was barely above a whisper. She had defended my mother for 12 years. At every holiday table, in every church pew. She set the letter back down slowly, carefully, the way you set down something that has burned your fingers. Elliot wasn't finished. He looked, for the first time all morning, directly at his grandparents. And he told them the one thing not a single person on their side of the table had understood. "The painting you want a share of," he said. "It's these." He touched the row of returned cards with 2 fingers. "It's the ones you sent back." I had a printed image of undeliverable in my folder, and I laid it on the table next to the cards so the whole room could see it for themselves. The stacked envelopes. The 2 red words repeated across the canvas. It was the same. The $2.3 million painting the entire art world had praised as a meditation on rejection was, down to the last brushstroke, a portrait of the birthday cards my mother had refused. They had driven 2 hours and hired a lawyer to demand a share of a monument to their own cruelty, and they had not even recognized what they were looking at. Prescott, for the first time all morning, had nothing to file. There was nothing left to argue. You cannot cross-examine a row of envelopes with your own client's handwriting dragged across them in red. My father had not said a word the entire meeting. He did not say one now. He looked at the cards, and he looked at his sister at the end of the table, and then he looked down at his own hands. My mother started to speak twice and stopped both times, the practiced grief gone somewhere she couldn't reach it. Meredith let the silence sit for a moment, and then she said, very quietly, "I think we're done here." And it was true. They gathered their coats without the performance they'd walked in with, and they drove the 2 hours home to a town that was about to hear a very different story than the one they had spent 12 years telling. The claim died in a single sentence. A week later, Prescott sent one final letter. Short this time, no raised gray letters, no soft threats. Just a line saying his clients were withdrawing all claims and would not be pursuing the matter further. The guardianship petition was never filed. Elliot's money stayed exactly where it was, in a trust with his name on it and my clean record sitting beside it. On paper, it was over in 9 words. In Ashford, it was only beginning. Because Nora went home and did not keep quiet. She had held that letter in her own hands and seen her sister-in-law's handwriting, and she could not unknow it. She called me a few days later, and she cried, and she said the one thing I had long ago stopped hoping anyone would ever say. I believed her because it was easier than doubting her, she said. I'm sorry I made you carry that for so long. I didn't tell her it was okay because it wasn't, and we both knew it. 12 years is 12 years, and no apology reaches back that far, but I thanked her for finally seeing him. That felt true, and it was all I had to give her. The real story moved through Ashford the way her lie had, living room to living room, church hall to church hall. Except this time it carried something heavier than a rumor. People who had comforted my mother for over a decade began, slowly, to do the math. The daughter who supposedly abandoned her parents had mailed birthday cards for years and had them refused, unopened. The selfish woman who hid the grandson had a letter in Vivian's own hand, asking to have a 5-year-old placed in a facility. My parents did not go to jail. No one was arrested. Nothing so dramatic as that. They simply lost the one thing they had spent 12 years building and guarding above everything else. Their good name. The reputation they had traded my son to keep. Wade called me, eventually. The same cousin who'd asked what they were supposed to think. He didn't have a speech ready, which is how I knew it was real. He just said he'd seen the letter, that it had gone around, and that he was sorry he had ever repeated a word of any of it. I told him I appreciated the call, and I meant it, and I also didn't rush to make him feel better, because I'd spent 12 years being the one who kept everyone else comfortable. Some of the family reached out after that. Some of them went quiet in a new way, the way people go quiet when they've been caught believing something because it was easy. I didn't chase a single one of them. I had learned that people who need proof before they'll treat you decently will always need more of it, and I was finished producing evidence of my own worth. Elliot, for his part, seemed almost untroubled by the fallout. When I asked him once whether he was angry, he thought about it and said, "I already knew. Now they know too." For him, the meeting had never been about revenge. It had been a correction, a record set straight, the way you'd fix a caption under a photograph that had been wrong for years. My father never wrote that letter to Millbrook, and I want to be fair about that, because fairness is the whole point. He also never once stopped it. He sat silent in that conference room the way he'd sat silent at the kitchen table 12 years earlier, the same way he'd been silent for every returned card in between. I used to think silence was a neutral thing. It isn't. Some people don't disown you with words. They just let it happen, and then they let it be told wrong for years, and their quiet turns out to be a signature all its own. By May, the shape of our lives had settled into something I could finally, honestly call peace. I set a boundary, and I set it clearly, without heat. No money, no oversight of Elliot's trust, and, for now, almost no contact at all. My mother sent one more letter that spring, and I recognized the weight of the envelope in my hand before I opened it, so I didn't open it. I put it in the tin box, unopened, because that felt like the right place for things that were never going to be answered. I didn't need her to admit what she had done. I had stopped waiting to be believed the day my son believed me for me. The money changed less than you would think, and the thing it changed most was Elliot's sense of what he could do with a room, with a table, with a life. He decided in his own time and in his own words that he wanted part of it to go toward other kids. An art program run through his trust for autistic children who need a place to make things and be met instead of managed. I want other kids to have a chair at the table, he told me, a real one. See, the boy his grandparents had tried to call incapable sat down at 17 and decided, all on his own, what a fortune was for. And he started a new painting. It's the same table he's been painting since he was 10. The same window. The same careful light. But the chairs aren't empty this time. There are 2 of them. And they're taken. Him and me. When I asked him about it, he thought for a long moment, the way he does. And then he said, "This one isn't about who didn't come. It's about who did." The tin box still sits on the shelf. It's lighter now. Most of what used to live inside it has done its work and been set down. It holds one thing these days, the sealed envelope he brought to that meeting and never mentioned again until we were home and the door was closed. Because there was one last thing my son did in that room that I haven't told you yet. One thing that was never for his grandparents at all. After Nora set the letter down, after the painting was on the table and the case was already finished, Elliot took that sealed envelope out of the box and handed it across to me. Not to them, to me. On the front, in his own handwriting, it didn't say Grandma, and it didn't say Grandpa. It said, "To the person who stayed. I stopped sending them to you a long time ago," he said, and I understood he meant them. The last one I made was for you. I understood then what the paintings had always been about, underneath everything the critics had written. The envelopes, the empty chairs, all of it. They were never a wound he was showing the world for sympathy. They were a record. A careful, patient record of who had been left at the table after everyone else refused the invitation. My parents spent 12 years writing a story about the daughter who walked away. My son answered it, quietly, in a language they never learned. And the answer was that I had never gone anywhere at all. If any of this reached something in you, if you've ever chosen a person over a family that asked you not to, tell me about it in the comments. I read them. Subscribe if you'd like to stay, and I'll see you in the next story, about another family who came back only when it was already too late to matter. Thank you for being here with me. Some of us are still learning, later than we'd like, that family isn't the people who return when you finally have something worth taking. It's the people who never needed a reason to stay.